Hallelujah, everybody. It's great to be in the house of God. Thank you, Jesus. You may be seated if you like. I'm so excited about being here with you all, and to Pastor Jerry and to Sister Christina. Hallelujah. Y'all are awesome. Awesome people. And I gotta say, this is one of the greatest churches in the whole world. Now, I'm not talking about the building, I'm talking about the people who use the church. Can I get a witness? And you've been taught well. Jesus, he had a great description for you. He said, by this shall all men know you're my disciple. By the love. This is the loveliest church I believe I've ever been in. Thank you. Thank you. Brother Tim Cohen, I'm so excited. I'm overjoyed to see what God's going to do. And just to bring to revelation so many great things. So, I'm not going to do a whole lot of talking. I'm going to do more singing. Some of y'all are thinking, praise the Lord. But I did a lot of talking last night. And, but I can't ever say enough about Jesus. He knows everything. Thank you, Lord. So I'm going to hurry and get out of the way, because I'm as excited as you are about hearing the Word of God. Well, about 12 o'clock last night, I got good news for every one of y'all. He said he makes his mercies new each morning. Hallelujah. So get ready again about 12 o'clock coming up. He makes his mercies new. Hallelujah. Praise. So today, I just started living again for the first time. Beautiful. I'll awake tomorrow morning. Hallelujah. With a smile on my face, a song in my heart. Turn to somebody and say, I just started living. maybe say, you might ought to move over just a little bit and give me a little space. Somebody move. I'm feeling something inside. Though I can see with my eyes, it's something more than life. It is the Spirit of God. Don't try to figure it out. The devil will make you down. Let go and let God be God. Get ready for the wind and fire. Somebody move. Give me some space. Give me a little to dance and just in case. When the Holy Ghost falls, he can land anywhere. He can be over here or maybe over there. Somebody move. The windows are open wide. Just let your heart be your guide. The floodgates went for the sound. For heaven and earth to collide. The price is already paid. The price is already been paid. It's time to lift up the name and give a little shout of praise. Somebody move, give me some space. Give me a little to dance and just in case. When the Holy Ghost falls, he can land anywhere. He can be over here or maybe over there. Somebody move. I can't stop praising him. He's done so much for me. Every day I love him, nothing more. He set me free indeed. He broke the chains from me. Never go back where I was before. I can't stop praising him. He's done so much for me. Every day I love him, nothing more. He set me free indeed. He broke the chains from me. Never go back where I was before. Somebody move. Give me some space. Give me a little room to dance and just in case. When the Holy Ghost falls, he can land anywhere. He can be over here or maybe over there. Somebody move. Give me a little space, man. I feel something coming on. We will serve the Lord. In other words, we're going to make a stand for the Lord. Somebody shout glory to God.
So let's start this again. The series is called Solar Apocalypse. It's 7 volumes. It addresses non-terrestrial life throughout our solar system. And that means Mars, the moon, our moon, other bodies in the solar system. And I'm not talking about conjecture, I'm talking about hard evidence, actual proof. So, our solar system was, and to some degree remains, populated by hybrids. Many of them were wiped out by God, and we're going to talk about that tonight. Space agencies continue to lie to the public. They know about some of this, and it's not just NASA, so other nations' space agencies are involved as well. There we go. So these are the 7 volumes. The titles may change. If you look on Prophecy House's website, you'll see that you can purchase them, but I'll tell you now the titles might change. The prices hopefully will go down when they come out, but it's expensive to do books, particularly electronic books full of color photos. Yeah, they charge you by the number of bytes actually in the files to download the pages and to see them electronically, so it's unfortunate, but it's reality. So The who, what, when, why, and where of non-terrestrial, quote-unquote, alien life. Alien is in quotes because I want to be clear, I don't believe there is such a thing as real aliens, and I'll define what alien is in a while. Unless you want to call angels aliens, since they didn't actually originate on Earth and they originated independently here.
Amen. Amen.
Okay? Alien infestation of Mars, alien infestation of the Moon, alien infestation of comets and asteroids, evolutionary cosmology upended. And I probably should say cosmogony, so I may change that title. But alien infestation of Pluto and other planets, counterfeit aliens and claims of secret space programs. In other words, programs that the public has not been told about. Soft disclosures of aliens and secret space programs in media. So that's the kind of stuff that you see in Star Trek or Stargate or some of these other science fiction shows that you think, well, that's interesting, but what you don't realize is that there's some truth to things that they're sharing, mixed with a lot of lies. Okay, so you can ignore this. That's just for people who read this later when they see it on the website. I'm warning people not to mess with me to try to stop me from doing this, basically. All right. Because there are people who would like to do that if they realized even some of the things you're going to see here tonight. All right, so I want to start with the fall of mankind. You know, a lot of people are familiar with Genesis chapter 3. You know, serious Christians are. But there's actually quite a lot that's buried in the text and implied in its subtleties that tie directly to this issue of fake aliens and what's going on with the whole alien agenda in the world today. So I'm going to simply read this to you because I want you to hear this. This is not your normal English translation. I've actually made some corrections to it. And the differences are quite significant, and I'll point them out as we go. And the Lord God commanded man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or calamity, you shall not eat from it, for the day of your eating from it you shall surely die. Now we know that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years to man, right?
Amen.
Amen.
And Adam and his descendants prior to Noah's flood lived to be just under a millennium in age. Much longer lifespans than we have today. But they did die within the same day, if you construe it as the day of the Lord in this context. Within the same millennium. Now the serpent, or the red dragon, now this is one example. The word that's there for serpent, there are multiple words in Hebrew for serpent, and they're all used in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. But there's one unique word that can be translated as red dragon. It was used of the serpent raised on a pole in the wilderness, to which Israel had to look to avoid continuing to die from its sin, which represented Christ on the cross, taking the sins of the world on the cross. That serpent was a fiery copper or a red dragon. It's also used here in Genesis 3. So when we read in Revelation 12, 11 and 12, where it talks about the serpent of old, the dragon, deceived Eve in the Garden of Eden, which is identified as Satan. It's a fiery red dragon in Revelation. That's because John, who penned Revelation under inspiration from God, actually used the correct translation.
Amen.
He was a little more involved than just saying serpent, okay? So it was like a red dragon that Eve saw. And this was, of course, before snakes lost their legs. In the first one, they still had legs. All right. So now the serpent, or red dragon, was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said to you, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? So he cast doubt immediately on whether God was truthful or not. Right. To Eve, who had only heard about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and not to partake of it from her husband, Adam. She didn't hear it directly from God. She heard it from Adam.
Amen.
Secondhand.
Amen.
So there was more room to cast doubt in her mind. So has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And by the way, Israel's rabbis, some of them have said that Satan wanted to marry Eve and take Adam's place because he thought she was so beautiful. And we know that fallen angels did cohabit with human women subsequently and found human women attractive, right?
Amen. Amen.
Okay? There's no indication in Scripture, however, that happened with Eve and Satan.
Right.
But nonetheless, there is something significant here. And he said to the woman, again, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, or the red dragon, we may eat of every fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die.
Amen.
And the serpent, or red dragon, said to the woman, you will not surely die. So he's immediately calling God a liar.
Right.
For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be as God.
Right.
Okay, not necessarily God's plural, but like God himself.
Right. Amen.
Knowing good and evil, or calamity, affliction. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that he, not it, okay, so this is a significant difference in translation, he, okay, meaning the serpent, or Satan, was desirable, meaning delightful, pleasant to the eyes.
Okay, amen.
Eve actually had desire for Satan at that point.
Amen.
It wasn't the fruit that this passage is talking about right here. Not the fruit of the tree, but the serpent in it, or Satan.
Wow. Amen.
Okay? So again, when the woman saw the tree was good for food, and that he, the serpent, was desirable or delightful, pleasant to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable for wisdom, or for the wisdom of God. You know, most English translations say to make one wise. Is not what the Hebrew text says. It says, for the wisdom of God. So the implication here is that if Eve were to partake of that fruit and disobey God and believe this serpent, or Satan, whom she found to be attractive, that she could become like God and have the same wisdom that he has. The implication is that God ate from the tree. That's where he got his wisdom. He was once a man like Adam. And now he doesn't want to share it.
Yeah.
And so the serpent's coming along as the good guy to say, hey, you've been deceived.
Yeah.
You can be just like him. Don't listen to him. Eat from the fruit and you'll have God's wisdom. That was a big part of the lie.
Amen.
And as you're going to see when we get later into this, it's part of the lie of the counterfeit aliens and the transhumanist movement.
Amen. Amen. Right.
And also paganism before transhumanism. So we'll touch on that hopefully tonight.
Amen.
Anyway, so okay, so she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave it to her husband with her, and he ate. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they saw that they were naked. So think about this for a moment. Satan is saying to Eve, you can be like God, and even have his knowledge, his wisdom, if you partake of this fruit. Right?
Right.
And of course, God walked in the garden with them. They knew that he shone with his glory, right?
Right.
They didn't know they were naked. And you remember when Moses was with God
Yeah.
on Mount Sinai for 40 days?
Amen.
And he came down and his face was glowing and he didn't even realize it. And Israel saw him, you know, the elders of Israel and so forth saw him and they were afraid to look at him.
Right.
And so he had to cover his head with a veil when that was happening, subsequently, because they were afraid.
Right.
How did Adam and Eve know they were naked? Were they covered in God's glory before the fall?
Yes.
And it was gone after the fall.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
And you know, when we're in God's kingdom in our resurrected or translated bodies, you know, at the last trumpet, we will shine like the sun
Amen.
in God's kingdom in our resurrected bodies.
Amen.
We will glow
Amen. Jesus.
in the same way the Lord does, because our bodies will be like his resurrected body, right?
Amen. Amen.
And I presume very similarly to how Adam and Eve were before the fall. So the serpent is saying you can be like God and you can have all this, right? How did God solve the fall in the end? So let's continue. Then the eyes of both of them were opened and they saw that they were naked and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. And the woman said to God, the serpent or the red dragon deceived me and I ate. She took no responsibility.
Right.
Right.
It's the serpent's fault. Yeah, nothing about, I didn't pay attention to what Adam told me and I didn't believe that he was telling me the truth, or I thought the serpent had a point. You lied to us, we could have eaten from this fruit, and geez, we could have been just like you. What's wrong with you, right? None of that, but then they realized they were naked and they suddenly realized that they'd been deceived.
Right.
Right. Amen.
Wow.
So God told Satan after all of this, I will put enmity or conflict, hostile conflict between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. Now let me ask you, what kind of seed does Satan have? Or did he have at that point? He had the fallen angels, right?
Amen.
Who transgressed against God with him,
Right.
but he didn't make them. They weren't his seed.
Yeah.
So Christians have looked at this, theologians have, and they said, well, this is obviously a reference to the Antichrist, when the Lord comes and he crushes the Antichrist's head. And I know something about the Antichrist, right?
Right.
So, but I'm saying actually this is more compassing than that.
Interesting.
Just as we are the collective seed of God in Christ, right? We're baptized into his body, making us the collective seed
Amen.
of God in Christ.
Amen.
And we stand in Christ's righteousness before God, in Messiah's righteousness. Satan has a collective seed.
Amen.
And that's everyone not in Christ.
Right.
But this is going further than that, as we're going to see. There's a real progeny, a real seed involved here
Amen.
that's beyond fallen mankind. And we're going to come to that. So began the solar apocalypse and cataclysm. In other words, we think that the fall was God cursing the creation, bad things happened on earth. So we got thorns, we got death, we got aging, we got decay, we got toiling to produce food, right?
Right.
By the sweat of our brows. And we got murder and all kinds of sins. On and on it goes. They invent new sins every day, probably, in this world today. It gets really bad. But Eve did not have sex with the serpent, but her descendants bore children to fallen angels.
Yes.
They were taken, Scripture says.
Yes, right.
In other words, not necessarily volunteering to be taken. They were simply taken and impregnated by these fallen angels. These are the Nephilim, and the word Nephil in Hebrew, the singular version of the word, means fallen, and it means liar. And the context in which it's used determines its meaning. Okay?
Amen. Amen.
So it could be talking about a man who fell. I tripped and I fell. But the context here is that they're spiritually fallen, and it also means liar. So I abbreviate it, and I give the greatest summary that I can, which is 2 words, and it's got multiple meanings, and that's just fallen liars.
Amen.
Okay.
Okay. I'll get used to these buttons eventually. So when it's got an asterisk there at the top of the slide, I'm going to skip through that. So Nephilim and dinosaurs, hybrids. There are Christians who think that the dinosaurs were hybrids, that God didn't intend them to exist, particularly the carnivorous, dangerous ones like Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor and these nasty ones that they like to depict in movies like Jurassic Park and so forth. Okay? That's what they think. Scripture is silent, however, on the point. It doesn't talk about it, really, at all. And I'll come back to Behemoth the Leviathan in case any of you have that question in your mind right about now.
Amen.
All right? But I'm going to suggest to you now, and we'll get further into it, that dinosaurs were hybridized by the Nephilim, that they set about on a very massive program to remake life on Earth in their own image as hybrids. And to see what they could do, if they could outdo God. Bigger, badder, faster. Okay? Wasn't what God intended. And let me just mention here, this isn't in my slides, but there have been paleontologists and biologists already, actually, alive in our generation, who have talked about and actually sought to reverse engineer dinosaurs, to produce them intentionally by hybridizing birds like chickens with reptiles. They've actually engaged in the effort, in the science for it, because they've realized that dinosaurs like T-Rex, Velociraptor are related to birds, in fact. And there's evidence that some of them actually have feathers, or we'll call them stubby, like new baby chick type feathers. Okay? A lot of people don't realize that. We see just the reptile skin and we don't understand that some of these creatures were covered in feathers, historically. So the question is, why would God place something so dangerous to other life on earth in our midst? And this is a question, that Christians have to ask, because it's one reason we get mocked by non-believers. The notion, dinosaurs having died out thousands of years ago and been in our midst seems silly, ludicrous. That God would do that. And yet it has to be so if the dinosaurs died out in Noah's flood. And mankind's only been here for a little less than 6,000 years, and all of the life has, right? So we need an explanation for that as Christians, and given Scripture's silent on it, we need to say, okay, what can we observe? And determine on the basis of what we can actually prove. And at this point, we know that dinosaurs and chickens, some of them, are related, particularly the dangerous ones. Let's do this button thing here. Okay. Skip those. The proto-evangelium. So God told Satan, and I will put enmity, hostile conflict. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. With the wrong button. How do we do that? Okay. You guys wanted to see these again, right? The fancy animation. Okay. I have to remember it's the bottom button. If I do that again, just yell at me. Bottom button. Thank you. All right, Behemoth and Leviathan, right? So we know that God created large land-dwelling creatures and large sea-dwelling creatures. And Leviathan is commonly translated as sea monster in Scripture. Behemoth isn't usually translated as much of anything other than just behemoth, or something to indicate it was a large land-dwelling creature. So Christians have looked at Behemoth and Leviathan and said, okay, God must have created the dinosaurs, right? That makes sense, because there were sea monsters, and you get sailors with their legends, dangerous stuff popping out of the sea.
Amen.
And actually, in fact, you've got records of dinosaurs walking the earth carved with humans in ancient carvings.
Amen.
That's something evolutionists like to ignore because they're embarrassed by it. But nonetheless, what if Behemoth and Leviathan are just big creatures like elephants and giraffes? I mean, I don't know. We know that there were larger creatures, versions of what we have on Earth today, like the oryx bull, bigger than today's bulls. The woolly mammoth, bigger than today's elephants, usually. Unicorn-like creatures, bigger than today's horse.
Yeah.
Right?
Amen.
There were lots of creatures that were versions of what we have today that were bigger, creatures got big.
Amen.
Okay? And Leviathan, what about squid? They can be pretty nasty, the giant squids, right? They get pretty huge. Or some whales.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that is what God meant here. I'm saying it's possible. Maybe God created brontosaurus because they were herbivorous and they didn't go around eating people. We don't know. But I'm going to say to you that dinosaurs as a general category, certainly the dangerous ones, were not intended by God. And it's my conclusion that they're hybrids. And one reason for that is going to become clear as we get into the presentation here. When I show you some actual dinosaurs we're talking about, and we'll definitely show you some this weekend though. So, yeah, you got that? The flood, killing the hybrids. So the flood was largely about undoing the wickedness that the Nephilim had wrought and that the fall of mankind had wrought on the earth. And the only thing Scripture really tells us is that the world became full of violence, right? It became very violent. And God regretted what He created as a consequence. And so He decided to bring the flood.
Amen.
And to save only what He brought to the ark, to come aboard the ark.
Right.
So He compelled the creatures that He wanted to survive to come to the ark.
Amen.
And we'll get to sea creatures in the ocean here in a moment, why the dinosaurs of that sort aren't around anymore. But because obviously the flood was just water, right? Mostly, okay. Anyway, the description of the flood, how it was triggered, is very interesting. And it's something that we easily overlook as Christians. We don't really ask a lot of questions to ourselves or to others concerning what it means. How was the flood actually triggered? How did it happen? Was there more to it than what happened on earth? Okay?
Okay, amen.
So they're very important points to understand and to think about. And frankly, we as Christians need to know this if we're to interact with macroevolutionists today who are scientific, who are looking at the claims of modern astrophysics, the claims of how dinosaurs died on Earth supposedly 65 million years ago through a large asteroid impact, right?
Right.
They found the crater, at least one big crater for sure.
Yeah.
That could have done it by itself. If the world was like it was today and it had dinosaurs.
Right.
It's more involved in that. So the Scripture says the windows of heaven were opened. What are the windows of heaven? You ever wonder about that? When I first read this as a new believer, I thought, okay, it means it rained, right? But then it separately says that it rained on earth. The rain was on the earth. We know that happened for 40 days and 40 nights. And then it additionally says all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. And the way I've typically heard that taught is it means that God did something that crushed the pillars underneath the supercontinent, which was had water beneath it, with pillars of stone or something holding it up. And then this geyser system coming up from the crust of the earth, watering all the plants. And producing steam, whatever in the atmosphere, so some of it would come back down. But it never rained. on the Earth, and the rainbow was never seen on the surface of the planet, meaning the atmosphere had to be thicker, so that that bent light was deflected out of the atmosphere before it ever reached the surface to be seen. Okay? So we had a thicker atmosphere, more water in the atmosphere. We had water underneath the supercontinental crust, which may have been a shell that enveloped the entire planet, with lake-like seas pocketing it, and this geyser system coming up. That's a view that one fairly popular creationist has put forward. Another view is that it was a Pangea-like supercontinent surrounded by one huge ocean. Okay? We don't know for sure which it was. I did think it was the latter, but I'm kind of leaning toward favoring the former right now. Regardless, that stuff was broken up, that supercontinent, or the shell, was shattered, so that all that water that was underneath it could come rushing over it and flooding it from beneath, in addition to all that water collapsing from that supersaturated water vapor canopy atmosphere, so that it literally rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But in that mix, you've got this thing that says the windows of heaven were opened.
Okay, amen.
There are three heavens. The first is our atmosphere. The second is space, the universe that we see. And the third is where God's throne is, beyond the universe. Right? So, the windows of heaven in this context is the atmosphere was opened. If we saw that happen today, let's say from a massive meteor or asteroid coming into the Earth, ripping the atmosphere apart, and striking the Earth quickly, you'd have a hole in the atmosphere that needed to be filled, a void, that for some period of time would be open. And while it was open, you would see space, blackness of space, from the ground. Okay? So, this gets into what we see in our universe. We look at the moon and we see it scarred with all kinds of pits, right?
Right.
We have pits on Earth. They found some of them. Even though the flood was so massive and so changing to the topography and the geography of the Earth, it just wiped everything out that was on the surface. Some of the craters were big enough to survive in a detectable fashion on Earth today. It's nothing like that on the moon, and you see the craters all over it. But it's not uniform. The moon is such that you can see that certain areas of the moon were struck more than others, as if it shielded the Earth at the time from the worst of it. Okay? But our moon also was not a gray ball of dust before that happened, and I'll get into that too. Bottom button. Okay, get into this. All right, so the flood killed the hybrids. Basically all the surface-dwelling dinosaurs. Everything God didn't bring aboard the ark that wasn't intended, in addition to the Nephilim. And disembodied Nephilim, which were those human-angel hybrids, became the demons. Do you ever wonder why demons and angels are distinguished in Scripture? Why a demon can possess a creature, but there's no description other than Satan entering Judas of angels ordinarily possessing human beings, but that's described with demons.
Right.
And it's because demons were half human, half angel, and they shed their bodies, they were killed, but they wander the earth now as spirits that want to possess a body, as these malevolent spirits. Okay? And they can take a physical appearance, by the way. When you see them, they look like a shape, like a shadow. And they can actually look hominid, even. They've been captured on film that way. I personally have seen one with my eyes. And the only way you see them is they're a dark shade and there's no light shining through. I saw one at night one time that attacked me when I was a young believer, when I was working on my Messiah History and the Tribulation period. I'd gone to bed at night, laid down on my bed, was just getting ready to go to sleep. And I had this lady living next door with her son. They were both witches on the dark side of it, the evil side of witchcraft, and the Wicca. And he would wear a satanic pentagram and dress in black, and she would do the same sort of thing. They moved in right next door to me, literally on the other side of my bedroom wall. And one night, after I'd been witnessing to her son, I lay down on my bed, with my face up, lying on my back, getting ready to go to sleep, and this thing shows up just to the left of me. So my bed is like this, the window's here. That wall right there is this lady and her son's condominium. And so this dark thing shows up right on the side of me, and I hear this audible growl. It was audible.
Wow.
And then instantly the thing jumped on me. and I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. It's like a mild electric stimuli or shock that you feel like a tingling throughout your body, and you cannot move. And but eventually you get your mouth to move, and I rebuked it in the Lord's name, and instantly like that it was gone. And nothing like that ever happened. So my point is, if you're not a believer, something like that can actually enter you in possession. Okay? But these things, and I saw that years before I ever saw one actually on film. And they've been associated, and I mention it tonight, because they actually have been associated with the so-called grays, these spindly, hominid gray aliens that come in anti-gravity craft, one of the quote-unquote races of quote-unquote aliens. So there have been people who've captured grays, as they come in at night, because they realize something weird is happening to their family, on film. And not only does a gray show up, briefly caught, but then this shadow does, walking through the room too, the shade. So things like that have actually happened and been captured on film, which is weird. All right, so the point is, Earth was bombarded by comets and asteroids. Our moon also was. Astrophysicists, a lot of creationists even, think that our solar system, because you see this bombardment happening to pretty much all the bodies in the solar system that we can examine, their surfaces, they think that our solar system passed through a cloud of debris, cometary and asteroidal debris. That's not true, and I'm going to get to proof that that's not true this weekend. However, something did happen in our solar system. We look at Mars today, we see it was gouged. We look at our moon, we see what happened there. I'm going to get into that later in this presentation, but God didn't just kill hybrids on Earth, is my point. All right, so demons remained on Earth, but dangerous life still lives elsewhere in our solar system. But God annihilated most of it right before the flood.
Amen.
Most of it where? Not on Earth. So these, how did he do that? So that was the comets and asteroids, and I'll get back to that in more detail. So Nephilim and quote-unquote aliens. Eve had this apparent desire, in some sense, for the serpent, for Satan. That is actually the root of the alien phenomenon. That unnatural desire between fallen angels and, at least I guess, some human women. But I presume that they took human women who they raped by force to impregnate them also. And took human beings who rejected God as servants and as slaves before the flood. Part of what led to the violence in the earth. And if we look in Enoch, which is an apocryphal work or pseudepigraphic, depending on your view of it, most of it is nonsense, but it's got a chapter in it, a very short chapter, that describes fallen angels providing scientific information, technical know-how for the time, to human beings, metallurgy, medicines, in this case herbs, things like that, to humans. So it's touching on this idea of some exchange of knowledge that man wasn't supposed to receive non-organically in that fashion, right? When God created Adam and Eve, they had knowledge from the very start. They had language. They didn't have to learn it. God put it into them from the beginning, from when they took their first breaths. But the rest of us have had to learn it.
Right, amen.
Okay, so what are the humanoids really? What are they? How many people think they actually exist? And it's fine if you don't. I want to know that too. Okay, so most people don't think they exist. All right, very good. That's what they want you to think.
Yep, that's right.
So far. Okay. What are they? So they have fooled governments into thinking that they were involved in creating mankind by tampering with the genomes of early hominids on Earth, meaning apes, chimpanzees, creatures like that, to produce mankind. And how are they able to fool governments like that behind the scenes? They do it by saying, look, we've got genes in common with you. Test us genetically. We're related. And in fact, their genomes are substantially the same as ours. They're closely related, particularly with the grays. However, there are multiple varieties of these humanoids that are being produced. So when the Nephilim on Earth died, they didn't all die, because they weren't all on Earth. They were traveling our solar system doing things. And we'll get into what they were doing later in these presentations, and I'll give you actual proof of it also. So they were doing things, meaning some may have survived off Earth, but Earth wasn't the only planet damaged. It was just the least damaged of the planets. Our moon was habitable. It had an ocean and an atmosphere. Mars had a thicker atmosphere with a lot more oxygen than it has today, and it had a lot of water. It was very Earth-like. But it didn't have the life that God created here. Neither did our moon originally. Venus was probably Earth-like, but today it's an oven. 600 plus degrees. It's probably hotter than that, actually. So you can't survive there. Maybe some extremophiles from Earth could survive on Venus. Other bodies in our solar system, I can't tell you for sure whether they were Earth-like because we don't have enough data on them. I can tell you they were bombarded. And if they had some of the same things on them that our moon and Mars have on them. So, and we'll get to what those are. Meaning they were populated to some degree. All right. So these humanoids, God created life on Earth to reproduce after its own kind. Humanoids can't reproduce. How many of you heard the abduction phenomenon? So-called abductions of humans, right? By aliens. And there's always a similar story of being experimented upon medically or having ova or sperm removed or enzymes or stem cells, like from the back of the eye, or all kinds of other experiments done. And these people come back sometimes with scars, somehow rapidly healed. Sometimes they're introduced to humanoid children aboard craft and told these are your babies. Nurse them or teach them to have emotion or different things like that. Very bizarre, very creepy things that are reported. But these accounts are generally forgotten and they only come out under hypnosis. And the thing that makes them real is that it's not by 2 or 3 witnesses, but by tens of thousands literally. Several thousand recorded in clinical circumstances. And then books written about it, showing that these people have similar accounts, though they've never met each other, of what was done to them, and similar descriptions of who did it, and similar descriptions of meeting these little humanoid babies and these kinds of things. So I'm submitting to you that these creatures are reproducing through abduction of humans, and they are tampering with the genes, and they're mixing the genes with other life on Earth, meaning reptiles, insects, sometimes birds, sometimes sea creatures, other mammals, but they're producing hominids in the craft, okay? Not all of them are hominids, we're going to get to that. Most of them aren't. That's what they're producing in terms of the intelligent ones that are visiting Earth, and maybe even coming from bases subsurface on the Earth, and doing these terrible things, okay? So they're deceiving governments saying, look, we made you, you're related to us, here's the proof. Test our genes. And by the way, that's why we're hominids. Yeah? We evolved somewhere else on some other planet as hominids, and we came here and saw you had some hominids, and we mixed the genes, and voila, out you came. So then they claim to be our gods at the same time. We're here to look after mankind, to ensure we don't destroy ourselves. Through environmental catastrophes and not looking after the environment, this kind of thing. Those agendas seem reasonable to a non-believer and to someone who's stuck in believing macroevolution, evolution, and saying, okay, obviously there are genes in common. We're not sure what the explanation is, but yours might be true. Okay? So these creatures have been involved in technological exchanges behind the scenes, and I'll get into why that is later this weekend, with governments for non-interference in their abduction activities, where they have agreed not to kill humans in the process of doing what they're doing, but to return them mostly, quote-unquote, unharmed without a memory of what happened, a conscious memory, and to provide technology in the meantime to advance us with the same anti-gravity craft, more primitive than what they have, but built into it, with weapons, other kinds of technologies that they have. And they've been at it, bear in mind, for thousands of years under the Nephilim. Even if they aren't born, even if they're produced in some laboratory setting, by mixing genes successfully and bypassing the barriers that God put in place so that we can only reproduce after our own kind. Doing things God didn't intend it, like they did with producing dinosaurs, but in this case, hominids. Passing themselves off as fake aliens and saying, oh, by the way, we're not angels, we're not demons. We must have evolved, we're corporeal, you can kill us, we have flesh and bone, just like you. We have blood, just like you. Not angels, not demons. How do you explain that? Being raised or being taught Christianity, for example, raised in a Christian context, had no knowledge of any of this. And then suddenly you come face to face with the reality of counterfeit aliens, hominids. Okay, maybe through an abduction experience, through a family member who's experienced it, maybe filming an actual craft that you happen to catch on video. And there are a lot of videos like that on YouTube, real ones at this point, not all fake. So, how do you explain that unless you have some of this information, right? All right, so let's continue. Oh, I wanted to make one other point. Nephilim resurrection. The disembodied demons. If one of these hominids gets produced in some laboratory setting and a demon possesses it, just like it could possess a human being, a demon is a disembodied Nephil, right? So somebody possessed by a demon is in effect, you could say a resurrected Nephil, in a sense, right? But they're busy trying to produce humanoid bodies. But their agenda goes further than that, as we're going to see. All right, so they're seeking to be able to reproduce on their own without us, which is part of the reason that their efforts are so extensive. It's not merely to keep themselves going. They're trying to reach a point where they literally don't need us and they don't need certain other life on Earth. Why? So that then they can annihilate us with their still superior technology and completely supplant mankind on Earth. So they're another version of a satanic threat that mankind faces. It's not merely an issue of getting mankind to worship the devil. Ultimately, the devil wants to get rid of mankind made in God's image.
Right. Yeah.
And just like the Nephilim set about to remake life in their own image before the flood, with dinosaurs and so forth, hybridization programs, the same thing is happening with these fallen angels. It's been a long-term effort to reach a point where they can successfully hybridize life on Earth, replace the stuff that God cares about most, like human beings, particularly us, with humanoids. All right, so demons remained on Earth, but the Nephilim spread into our solar system, arguably beyond it. Their craft are capable of interstellar travel. Light is not a barrier because of the means by which they traverse. So, and we have the same technology, by the way, at this same point. At this point in time, we have the technology. It's not as advanced, but it can do the same things. All right, some breakaway humanoids and ostensible humans have reportedly been visiting Earth. So think about this. If the Nephilim were busy spreading hybrids like dinosaurs throughout our solar system, and they were, I'm going to show you examples this weekend. I'm going to give you proof. Things nobody can deny. If they were busy doing that, were they doing it by themselves? Or were they taking human worshippers, human slaves? They raped human women and impregnated them, presumably by force in some cases. Others would have worshipped them just like you've had pagans worshiping false gods down through history, right? They'd have done it voluntarily. So would they have taken humans, in other words, off Earth when they were establishing these worlds over which they were quote-unquote gods of hybrids they had produced by hybridizing life on Earth? Now think about this. God solved the problem of sin for us by coming down, taking on a human body, and making us as much like him as he could by saving us and offering us eternal life in a resurrected body. What Satan was offering to Eve through subterfuge and lies, which he couldn't really deliver, right? The transhumanists want to try to get there today. It's another satanic effort, right? Through technology and so forth. And the Nephilim tried to do by producing humanoid bodies that they could possess, if they're not going to possess a human being, say off-world or whatever. What he couldn't deliver, God has delivered to us through salvation and reality. And we will shine like the sun, and we will have eternal bodies, and we will share his wisdom. We will know as we are known.
Amen.
Under God, right?
Amen.
Okay. So the point in all of this is there could be, I'm not saying there is, there could be breakaway human civilizations on other worlds at this point. Where the Nephilim died out, maybe. Or where they're living in common with the Nephilim and worshiping them. Or they could have all been hybridized as humanoids at this point, and there might not be any humans like that. However, there is eyewitness testimony among people involved in secret space programs who actually deal directly with the quote-unquote aliens and actually travel in anti-gravity craft and by other technological means, supposedly. I'm not totally sure I believe it, but the same people who are claiming anti-gravity craft are claiming also teleportation, and that Tesla came up with the initial scientific knowledge that enabled the development of actual teleportation. Not just on Earth, but between Earth and other planetary bodies. So the point is, some of these quote-unquote aliens who are coming out of these craft look completely human. You can't distinguish them physically, except that they might look younger, maybe more attractive in some cases, who knows. They claim, however, to have lifespans that are closer to 1,000 years in age. Some of the ones coming off the craft. Others are humanoid. They're obviously not human. They look reptilian or like the Greys. But the point is there are reports of all of those. If there are any humans who are technologically advanced at this point coming from these worlds, from peoples who once worshipped Nephilim or were enslaved by them, as the case may be, they would be saved in the same manner as you and I. But I don't believe that the humanoids, which are basically abominations before God, can be saved.
That's right. Amen. That's right.
Okay, so humanoids are hybrids of humans and other creatures, which could be reptiles, insects, other mammals, birds, sea creatures such as fish, etc. The main thing about humanoids is they have a hominid appearance. But other than that pattern, they can look insectoid, they can look reptilian, they can look like the Greys, or they can look fully human and be just slightly changed. Okay, so non-humanoid hybrids off Earth. Noah's flood and fallen liars. I'm going to skip through some of this because I do want to show you some pictures tonight. But I will mention the Nordics right here. So, see if my laser's working. Oh, there we go. The Nordics right there. That's what these human-appearing, quote-unquote aliens coming off these craft look like. They're called Nordics. That's what they refer to them as. But they look human. These Nordics were the ones primarily involved early in the secret space programs, supposedly, by people who went public who were actually part of the programs. So William Tompkins is a name. You can look him up. William Tompkins is one person who was involved in the Apollo program, had the access during World War II to actually know that there were such things as crashed anti-gravity craft, etc. Worked on actually designing some of our own anti-gravity craft, like space carriers. I'm talking huge craft. He was responsible for that. And he had the documentation to prove that he was involved with that and went public. This is just a few years ago. All right, so enlistment to war. We know that Satan has sought to enlist mankind in this war against God. That's what the fall was about, apart from, perhaps corrupting Eve and that sort of thing. It was about engaging mankind in the war against God. And we know that man will make war against Christ and his angels at his return. Right?
Amen.
How does that happen? When we're talking about a situation of 1900 plus years, the whole world basically has heard that Yeshua is coming, Jesus is coming. Second Advent with his angels trailing behind him from heaven. And the sun's going to be darkened and the moon won't give its light. And he looks like a bright burning star. He's called the bright morning star. Right? And he is coming to the earth with his angels trailing behind him against this blackness of space where the sun is obscured and the earth is in darkness. How does the world think that it's a good idea to make war at that point against whoever's coming, after having heard that it's going to be, Yeshua, Jesus, with his angels? So it's a good cop, bad cop thing. You've got these fake aliens working behind the scenes with the governments, saying, we'll advance you technologically. No, they're not doing this for our benefit. Okay? You might have thought that that was my implication. You know, we think, those who are involved in these programs think, and I'm not one of them, so don't take me as a we that way, think that, okay, they're going to give us technology, yeah, as long as they don't kill the humans, we'll let them abduct some humans and get what they need from it, because they tell us that they've so evolved their own bodies over time that they can't reproduce anymore, so they need our help genetically to fix what they have corrupted, what they have messed up, right? But the reality is they could never reproduce. So in the meantime, governments think, okay, we're getting technology, and oh, by the way, these guys seem fairly benign, they're not killing humans generally, and we're getting some pretty great stuff. And they're telling us that there are these bad aliens out there who one day might invade and attack and would take our world from us. They're not doing that. So, you know, let's abduct some humans, we'll give you some technology, we'll work together as allies behind the scenes. And by the way, you don't have to tell the world about us. In fact, we prefer you didn't right now. Okay? And the governments are looking at this and saying, okay, they've got genes in common with us, they're hominid, they're not attacking us, but they could with their technology, and there'd be nothing we could do about it. They're trying to prevent us from nuking our planet into a cinder, so they must care about life on Earth, right? They must be benevolent on some level. You know, and if they're lying to us, well, we're getting technology out of it, maybe it'll help us if we have to go to war with these guys at some point. If it turns out they're not being completely honest with us, let's play along, okay? In the meantime, we won't tell the public about what's really happening. They only want to preserve life on Earth because they need us to reproduce. They don't actually care about mankind. They only want to arm us so they can engage us in the war against Christ and his angels when he comes.
Right.
As if that's an evil alien invasion.
Yeah.
In other words, they flip the truth.
Yeah. Amen.
Called good evil and evil good.
Right.
All right. So, today, why am I doing this? I want to get into this. I probably should have brought this up at the start of the presentation. Why I'm involved in this. I used to think, you know, when I became a new believer, that there couldn't be life elsewhere in our solar system. God created life here. The fall happened here. There's no information in Scripture, other than, you know, there being angels, about there being life off Earth. So at that point, for me to say, okay, there might be aliens, would have been the equivalent of, okay, I think this, I think that, so what? It's an argument from silence. There's no evidence, right? That's what I thought. But I did believe that there was such a thing as hominid, quote-unquote, aliens. I'd seen enough evidence for that in junior high school, long before I was a believer, well, years before I was a believer, to know that that was real, to know that the Nazis had anti-gravity craft that they were developing before and during World War II, that Germany did and the Nazis did, and that they were using those at the end of World War II. Have you guys ever heard of the White House being buzzed by anti-gravity craft, by saucers, in the 1950s? It made national and global news. I think it was dozens of these craft. It happened more than once. Surrounded the White House and were photographed by the press here in the United States. The public doesn't hear anything about that today, hardly at all. But it was huge news in our country. How has that been covered up? It's like silence in the news media, right? Were those aliens? No. They weren't. Those were Nazis in their anti-gravity craft saying, you better stop messing with us in Antarctica. They had taken facilities, ships, personnel to Antarctica and set up a base there during World War II, which they continued after World War II. And they basically, and I don't know exactly what they said, but something along the lines of, don't attack us, we won't mess with you. And by the way, our technology is superior at this point. Okay? And these weren't the Nazis who wanted to annihilate Israel. These were just Nazis, okay? Who were involved in scientific stuff. And NASA, our own acknowledged space program, not our only one, but our acknowledged military space program, had Nazis in Operation Paperclip who played huge roles in the formation of NASA and all of its early agendas, and even its agendas all the way through the Apollo era, up to the Viking landers on Mars, and even to this day. So NASA has had a very substantial Nazi or German Nazi influence Not quite the malevolent Nazi, but still Nazi. And still some people who are very anti-Israel, in fact, among them, helping the United States to build NASA. Okay. All right, secret space program, I'm going to skip that. Time enough to escape Earth, I want to mention that. So Noah was preaching for more than 100 years while he and his sons were building the ark, right?
Right.
So the Nephilim, even if they hadn't been leaving Earth and taking things off Earth, prior to that, had more than 100 years in which to do so. More than 100 years of warning that this cataclysm was going to strike Earth. Now, I think because of the density of the life that is actually out there, they had to have been doing it for more than that period of time. They had to have been doing it almost from the beginning of their inception. All right, we know there was a past war in the heavens, right? Because a third of the angels transgressed and fell and they were cast out of heaven. We also know from Revelation that there'll be a future war in the heavens around the time frame of the Lord's return, so not too distant future from now, when Satan and the fallen angels will get cast down to the earth, and at that point, no place will be found for them in heaven anymore. And in this case, we're talking probably about the second heaven, meaning space, not just the first, Earth's atmosphere, but it could be both, or it could be just Earth's atmosphere, because Satan is the prince of the power of the air, right?
Right.
Okay. But there's a war in the heavens coming. We know there was a past war because the angels transgressed and fell. What we don't know and what we're not told about in Scripture is what happened around the flood and whether there was a war in conjunction with that in our solar system.
Yeah, right.
A non-human war. Okay. All right, so demons are killed Nephilim. Humanoids are not highly evolved, as alien enthusiasts like to think. There's this idea, well, aliens are real. They must be really great guys because they were able to get here. Their technology's got to be so much better than ours, and they didn't wipe themselves out. They must be more benevolent than us. I mean, look at where we are, right? There must be something we can learn from these guys. And by the way, lots of abductees report being brainwashed into environmental agendas. It's a big part of what happens aboard the craft, apart from like eco-fascist kind of agendas, apart from experimentation, the biological stuff that happens with humans to produce more humanoids. So right now they're mostly reproducing through abduction, but they want to reach the point where they can reproduce through production, through reproduction, I mean to say. Whatever I'm trying to say. Through biological reproduction, okay? They aren't there yet. Intrasolar hybrid life, that's within our solar system. So the Nephilim filled our moon, which had an atmosphere and an ocean. It was habitable, just lower gravity, with hybrids. You can't walk anywhere on the surface of our moon today without running into fossils. Nowhere. You literally cannot, not even in the craters. They are everywhere. And in fact, I have photos of every Apollo astronaut walking among fossils and in some cases directly examining them. And when I'm talking about fossils, I'm talking about flash fossilized fossils, but sometimes skulls with exposed teeth and things like that. But when we talk about flash fossilized fossils, they don't look like just bones. And so we're going to get into that. This is one reason that the world hasn't caught NASA in its lies. It hasn't been looking more closely at these photos. Okay, let me skip the asterisk stuff. We'll come back to fossilization types. We're familiar with bones on Earth, right? Most fossils, we walk into a museum, we see skeletons, we're impressed. Once in a while, we'll see a depression, right, in a rock that's been dug up, like of a leaf, something like that, where the leaf itself isn't fossilized, but the impression is there. That's called a trace fossil. Okay? What we haven't heard about, most of us, is something called flash fossilization. Right there? Flash fossilization doesn't produce bones, it produces the exterior appearance of the creature, preserved in stone. And sometimes that capture of the exterior appearance is so extensive and so perfect that you get the pigmentation, the actual colors of the creature preserved in the stone. And sometimes it's so good the creatures look like they're alive. Not on Earth. I'm going to show you some off Earth. Okay? On Earth, they were all buried in the flood. Even the flash fossilized ones, pretty much, were buried. So, here's a fossil from Earth. Took somebody 7 years to chisel that out of rock. But you can see the scales are preserved. And they actually captured most of the body of this thing too. So I'm just showing, the front of it. This thing is about 30 feet long. That head right there is, I don't know how long it is, but I'm guessing 2 or 3 feet right now. Might even be 4 feet. So anyway, what I want you to see here is that this is a fossil from Earth where you can see it was a reptile, you can see the scales, you can see the depressions for the eyes. There are no visible bones there. And underneath it is, rock. So let me go back to that one. That's rock that they didn't chisel away underneath the thing. But a guy spent 7 years chiseling this thing out to expose it. That is considered to be the best example of a flash fossilized fossil on Earth that's publicly known. That was found a few years ago, I think in 2010 in Canada. So just a few years ago. In the 1980s, a fellow named David Martell, a paleontologist from the UK who's still active in the field today, wrote papers on flash fossilization. He was the guy who basically discovered that this could happen on Earth by doing lab experiments with creatures who had just been alive, like fish that he killed and so forth, and trying to fossilize them in hours to days. Because of things that he was discovering in the field, like this nodosaur, but fish and stuff like that. So he's trying to figure out, okay, how can this happen? How are these things getting preserved where we have the soft tissue down to the point where you can see the structure of the cells, when you section it. And you can see the organs preserved in the rock when you section it. You can see the brain, you can see all of it. How is that possible? Why aren't these things just bones, like most of the fossils we found? And he discovered that with the right combination of chemicals, a particular chemical, and microbes, particular microbes, and water, that you can fossilize creatures in hours to days, completely, turn them to stone, so that they're preserved like this. So on Earth, this is the exception, or we think that it is, because most of what we find is bones, right? We think it is. In reality, there's a lot more of this stuff out there that they don't realize. I've seen a lot of it. That they haven't realized are fossils just like this yet, often just laying on the surface of the Earth. But what we mostly find are bones. Okay. So on Mars, the fossils are superior. They're better than those on Earth most of the time. In many cases, they're superior to that nodosaur I just showed you. But they're also often contorted and difficult to recognize, and I'll explain why. But you also do get bones. Sometimes you find actual skeletons exposed on the surface of Mars, and I have examples of that also that I'll be showing you in that Solar Apocalypse series. I won't show you those this weekend. I'm going to show you things more like the nodosaur and creatures that are actually alive, that aren't on Earth. Okay? So let's start with this. So this is on Mars. That is a petrified piece of wood. And on top of it is lichen. Lichen is considered complex biology. More complex than microbes. It's a combination of algae and fungus, sometimes bacteria. So algae is considered a complex life. Oh, sorry. This is a black and white photo of the same piece of petrified wood. You can see it's been cut right there. And it almost looks like it's got a saw mark, but it actually just cracked right there. And this is part of the rover right there. They literally drove up to this thing to photograph it on Mars. Okay? If this was the only photo I could show you, if it was the only one, that would be proof of complex biology on Mars in the past and the present because of the lichen. So from this we know that at one time, Mars had plant life. Other than this petrified wood, I can't show you any plant life at all today on Mars. But there is lichen and there is algae. And I can show you lots of both of those. As well as fungus, also like mushroom-type fungus. But that's evidence of wood on Mars in the past. And probably not the distant past, since lichen is growing on it. And yet, NASA drove up to that thing, photographed it up close, never talked about it publicly. How do you explain that? While they're busy telling the public, we're trying to see if there's any evidence for microbes on Mars. Algae is way past microbes. Way past. And so is wood. All right. All right, so I got this pareidolia or paradenial, right? They tell us when we look at rocks and we see faces on Earth, because faces are very common, right? We like to see faces as human beings. We're honing in on faces all day long. That we're just seeing things. It's not really there. And of course, if it's a cloud, we know that's true. We're just seeing things, right? And sometimes we are really just seeing things. Okay? However, if it's a flash fossilized fossil, and it's a rock that looks like a head, maybe you're not seeing things. And there are, in fact, a lot of very large flash fossilized fossils on Earth that people have said, that can't be a fossil or a creature. Somebody must have carved it. Sometimes you see news items where they say, oh, this looks like a dragon's head or a serpent's head. Wonder who carved that? And it's like 30 feet big or something like that. Wonder who carved that. They're assuming that it was carved, even though they can't find any chisel marks, any tool marks. They don't know who did it. There's no historical record of it being carved or anything like that. Looks just like a creature, but it can't be a creature. And it's not bones, right? There's stuff like that all over the Earth. And you don't hear people talking about it most of the time. Okay? So pareidolia or paradenial. I made up the word paradenial. You have to add it to the dictionary, and I'm sure after my book comes out, or my series I should say, they will add it to the dictionary. So pareidolia is seeing something that's not there. Paradenial is an object and you're in denial about it. Okay? It's objective denial. Okay? This is a good object that they're in denial about. NASA took a series of photos of this on Mars. That is an iguana. It's a dead one. It's dead. It's a fossil. It's just like that nodosaur, but nobody had to chisel it out of the ground. And it's covered in dirt, a little red Martian dust. And on its tail right here are at least 2 other fossils stuck to the tail at the back of it, one of which is a little head. But the rest of the creature, you can see the back leg right there, the head, I mean, it looks exactly like an iguana on Earth. That's proof of genetic commonality between Earth and Mars. Either they came from here, or we came from there. Right? There's commonality. NASA's never talked about this publicly. They won't talk about it. And they took at least 4 photos of this. And it's in a bigger photo, by the way. You have to zoom in to see this thing. But it's not a huge photo, so it's one that's pretty obvious. You could find this today by Googling Mars iguana. You could pull up the actual NASA photos. You could download them directly from NASA tonight after you go home. What do they eat? So people say, well, Mars doesn't have anything for reptiles and insects to eat and creatures to eat, right? Sounds like a good point to anybody who doesn't know anything about biology on Earth. And most of us don't. That's not an insult. I didn't know what they were eating. When I started out and I found my first dinosaur on Mars, I thought, okay, what are these guys eating? Apart from each other, right? And they do eat each other. I'm going to show you a photo this weekend of one chomping down on another one. And a living creature eating another little creature. I'm going to show you that this weekend. Maybe tonight we get to it. We'll see how the time goes. So, primary food sources for reptiles, insects, a lot of birds, some mammals, like some squirrels, on Earth are algae, lichens, fungus. And lichens are a combination of algae and fungus usually. There's a lot of those things on Mars. So they do have a food source apart from each other. And this is one reason a lot of the photos that NASA's taken in these wetter areas on the surface of Mars that look muddy, and you can see the mud is clumping as the rover rolls over in the tracks. You can see clumped mud. So it's not frozen hard, in other words. as you might think from the claimed temperatures on the surface. You will see greenish and brownish and reddish background all over the soil in the background. And what you're actually looking at is algae. It's growing on the top of the soil, exposed to the soil. Now, I talked about fossilization, and I mentioned chemicals were a component of that. Mars and our moon, both for sure, have more of that chemical composition than Earth does. And they both used to have a lot of water on the surface. So if they also had microbial life, and I submit to you that since they've got an iguana, there must have been some microbial life, right? And we have proof actually that there's ongoing microbial life on Mars today. NASA has that proof. They've just lied about it to the public for decades. For 50 plus years, they've lied to the public about it. Oh, well, I should say, no, 40 plus years, I meant to say. Anyhow, they have stuff to eat. Remains from eating each other. Okay. Here's a question. If you look at the 3 rovers that NASA has had on Mars, and I'm sorry for my mic, I keep messing up the volume, sorry. I just can't get this thing to play nice. There we go. All right. All of the rovers look like big bugs. Yeah, they've got like the neck and the head and the wings. In the case of some of them, if they're not nuclear powered, if they're nuclear powered, they look like they've got, I think it's 6 legs, with the 6 wheels. But they're shaped so that they could look like strange extraterrestrial bugs to any life on Mars, so that maybe they'd leave them alone. Seriously, we're scaring them back. Okay, so we're scaring the scary creatures, not messing with our rovers. But actually, NASA's taken at least a couple of photos of what looks like a creature leaning against and messing with the rover. And I've got those photos in the series too. And one is where you can see a very obvious limb, like a green, spindly limb, going off to the side of the rover. That is not any of the wires on the rover. It's not like any of the wires in the rover. Okay. All right. I'll mention one thing. So insects tend to colonize. You know, they live in colonies. Many reptiles do as well on Earth. Now, when Mars was struck, and I haven't really described much of the cataclysm that occurred to you yet, and I'll tell you how it happened later. I'll just simply tell you that Mars, like Earth, was struck, only worse. And there's this big gouge in the surface of the planet that ripped out a portion of the topsoil. So you see this huge scar across the surface. Mars' atmosphere, a lot of it was blown into space. A lot of its ocean waters were blown into space. Some of its topsoil was blown into space. Creatures that were infesting its whole surface and its oceans, blown into space. Not all of it, though. And what remained on Mars, because it became suddenly colder with that thinner atmosphere and so forth, froze. So there's literally ice on much of the surface of Mars, right below that red dust. They've actually shown this. They've scraped into it with a rover, and they literally, like a centimeter or something under that dust, or an inch, whatever it was, got to white ice. And we know that the chemical composition of Mars soil is full of salts. It's very, very salty compared to Earth, perchlorates. And that means the freezing point of water is much lower on Mars. So there's a lot of salty brine and some liquid surface water on Mars at the warmer times of the day. So these creatures do have access actually to water. It's salty water, but it's there. But anyway, I brought this about, I mentioned this because Mars, you know, when you get a cataclysm like that against a planetary body, there's this fire that ensues, right? And so not only do you see creatures that got frozen in place subsequently, as they were struggling to take their last breaths, and just see their heads often exposed above the soil because they had to dig up through all that debris and try to take their last breaths, and they died like that, with their heads looking up or just exposed from the soil and frozen in place, just like that. And flash fossilized also in many cases, because there was enough water still for that to occur before the death completely took place. But in other cases, they're melted together, these colonies. So you get heads merged into heads, melted by fire literally, and then they fossilized like that, as clumps of heads merged together. And in other cases, the fossilization took place slowly enough to where these creatures piled on top of each other as they were dead, decayed enough to merge into each other before the fossilization was complete. So you see merged bodies, merged heads, merged faces, but the features are very obvious, and they're not always merged. There are plenty of examples where they're not, and I'm going to show you some examples. And we'll talk about this issue of mostly heads being exposed as we get into comets and asteroids later this weekend. I'm going to skip through some of these because I don't want to show you more obscure stuff. I'm going to show you more obvious stuff since we've been talking for a while. I'll get to this sometime this week, and I want to talk about this one. This is pretty hard to make out, but that's a shelled creature that's upright. You're seeing its belly right there, and this is its shell around its background. That's another creature's head right there, and so forth. This is the creature in a smaller version. NASA took a series of photos in this area, and that creature moved between the photos massively. And it wasn't the only one. There were actually 3 creatures that moved in that series of photos, meaning it's proof of ongoing life. That, to me, is not a great example of a photo of a creature on Mars, but I know it's a living one because of the movement in that series. And anyway, this is another one that I'll show you here. So I'll come back to that moving creature here later in the weekend. Notice this thing right here? Right there that I'm circling? That's a small reptilian head. And unfortunately, I have to show you a larger version of this, but that's its eye. Its mouth is open right there, and the bridge of its nose. It's exposed, popped just through the soil. And that's on Mars. And around it are all these blue things that NASA has started to call blueberries. You could Google it, Mars blueberries. And they think that those blueberries are just rocks that were formed through rivers and so forth that dried up. In fact, they're not. Many of them are little creatures that unfold like roly-polies. And in the better photos of some of them, they're not all blue. Some of them are greenish. In the better photos, you can make out the mouths and the eye areas and the nostril areas before they unfold. And some of them are rocks, but most of them are actually little creatures. And I've got better examples of those. I'm just talking about them. I'm not going to show you those photos because it's too hard to do that this weekend and at this distance, and I'd need to give you a lot of context to sharing those later. I'm only pointing it out because you've got another creature in the midst of those, and who knows, maybe it's out for a meal. I don't know. This could be a dead one. It could be a fossil, but it could also be alive and just popping its head through the soil. Okay, this is a fairly well-known photo among Mars anomalists, people who are thinking that there's life on Mars and trying to show it. People will look at this thing and say, oh, there's an ape on Mars. Right? That's what they do. They think it's a hominid with a hunchback on Mars. I don't think that that's what that is. And at this distance, it's probably a little hard to make out. Maybe I can show it to you better on this screen over here. Notice this thing right here to the right of that. You know, on Earth, we have creatures that have a lighter underside and a darker topside, like killer whales, for example. Sometimes there's some others. You're looking at a creature right here that's partially exposed behind this, and this may actually be part of its body too. That's what people look at, and they don't notice this bright black and bright white thing right here that's totally out of place for the rest of the picture. They ignore that. Everyone who's ever talked about this photo publicly. But that's not the worst thing that they've missed. What they've missed is this little horned dinosaur right here crawling out from behind a rock. It's got a horn on its head. There's a front leg, another leg. It's crawling out. There's its mouth and eye, the horn right there. Not a great photo, but nonetheless, a little dinosaur crawling out from behind a rock. They missed that. They also missed this thing right here, another fossil, another one. And there's another head in here somewhere. But anyway, I'll skip that. Let's move on to better things. Just give you some examples. So this is actually a very good one. So one thing I haven't talked about in this conversation is that there are people who say they've walked the surface of Mars who are alive right now, who are quote-unquote whistleblowers. They're liars, most of them. They claim to have been involved in secret space programs. They're mostly confabulating and making stuff up from sci-fi series and shows. Okay? But there are two people who I personally have interviewed, and I've tried to interview most of these folks who make these claims extensively. And if I find anything they share with me that they shouldn't know, that I know to be true, then I go further with them and I share some things that I have with them that they discussed with me that they didn't know I had photos for. And I capture their reactions live as they see the photos. Okay? One of those persons, well actually two of them, described to me dive bombing pterodactyls. And they've described this publicly for years, by the way. And their claims of having been on Mars, of having to shoot pterodactyls out of the air, from killing them, and having had to kill other dangerous creatures on Mars, or to run from creatures like T-Rex on Mars' surface when they show up. But the interesting thing about this photo, pterodactyls were pterosaurs. They were part of the pterosaur family. The interesting thing about this photo is that is the head of a pterosaur, exposed from the surface, with a wingtip and part of its claw on that wing. Two claws, right there. And that's the top of the beak. The beak has actually got color striations, like you would see on Earth, on some birds, or a reptile, like any variety of reptiles, actually. But this thing right here in the better photo, if I could show you a better photo, and it's probably hard for you to see this on your screen, but right here are exposed teeth. There's a row of at least 4 teeth that you can see at the base of the beak right here where I've got the laser pointer. There are 4 teeth exposed right there, and I can see it on my screen. If anyone wants to come see it later, I'll show it to you later this weekend on my screen. That was photographed by the rover from several feet away. It's probably as big as the rover, meaning that head is several feet in size. I presume it's dead, because just part of it is sticking out from the side of the hill, and it's mostly buried. And I looked at that for years. People have looked at this photo too, and I've got a lot that no one else has ever seen, but people have seen this one. They look at it and they think it's a spacecraft or some weird thing. When you find people talking about this, if you ever manage to find them, there are a few, they think, well, it looks like a spacecraft or some weird piece of technology or something like that sitting on the surface of Mars. But in reality, it's proof of life, and it is proof of pterodactyls on the surface of Mars. And I've got others that I will show you. Am I going the right way? Yeah. Okay, this is a living creature actually having a meal on the surface of Mars. It's as big as you and I at least, might be bigger, right here. And I'm going to show you a version of this where I have adjusted the brightness and contrast so you can see what's actually there in the shadow and the shape. But this is unadjusted. That's exactly as I received it from NASA. Just enlarged. No changes whatsoever. And around this creature are other creatures. So this is a little creature back here. This is the head of a creature that's probably dead, popped up through the soil. More creatures right here from behind this one looking past it. More fossils all around. These are fossils right here, fossilized heads. There's an eye, for example, a fossil. Fossilized heads, flash fossilized. And in the background is this box. A box on Mars. This thing actually has an X, or looks like an X engraved on it. Perfectly rectangular, partially buried in the sediment. Not a rock, per se. Shouldn't be there. Evidence of some form of technology being involved on Mars' surface at some point. Now, in the Solar Apocalypse series, I have photos of an actual stone quarry on the surface of Mars with evenly cut blocks, a whole bunch of slabs of evenly cut blocks, a chair sitting in the midst of them, a hominid humanoid body dead nearby, partially under one of the slabs. An actual stone quarry with a chair in the middle of it, sitting on the surface of Mars. And in the background of that quarry is a fossil that one of these two gentlemen, who I said I think could have been on Mars, who claimed to have been on Mars, were able to tell me about things they shouldn't know about. In the back of that stone quarry is a fossil of something, a hybrid, that one of these individuals described publicly years before NASA took the photos. He said he'd been on Mars. He described it as having a fat tortoise-like body, a long snake-like neck, and a horse-like head. He called it a plesiosaur, even though it looks nothing like what paleontologists on Earth call a plesiosaur. But because of that fat body and the long neck, and the smaller head, he just thought, okay, land a plesiosaur. And he said the thing could move fairly rapidly on the surface of Mars, and one tried to eat him. You know, and he was somebody who claimed to have gotten to Mars through jump gate technology, through a jump from teleportation, not by craft. I can't validate those kinds of claims, right? I don't have evidence for it, but I can validate that the creature he described actually was on Mars. And he shouldn't have known about it, and he was talking about it before NASA photographed it. And no one else in the world was talking about it, and he claims one tried to eat him, and I'll show you that photograph later this weekend. But this is one that he didn't talk about, no one else has ever seen. No one else probably even knows where to find this, except for me, in the NASA photos. And I'm going to show you an enlargement of this. So I've got better enlargements. This is one I did like a year and a half ago or something. And when I came, I showed this one actually to some of you here, but not that quality. What I showed you was far worse than this in quality because I wanted to keep that under wraps until I'd gone more public with some of these Mars stuff and gotten further along. I have better than this of that creature, and that right there is unambiguous. This is a creature that has a rectangular ear, an amphibian-like mouth, no teeth. Its lips are actually serrated, like you'd see a serrated edge of a steak knife. Its lips are serrated. It does not have teeth. It has an amphibian mouth. It's actually eating a smaller creature right here, and maybe I'll show you a better version of this weekend where you can make out that creature. But you can see that creature's mouth and its eye while it's being eaten by this other one. Here is a folded leg with a shoulder joint right there, an insect-like shoulder joint, folded wings. Okay? I call this thing a loctoid because it has an intelligent forehead, eyes like ours with eyelids, a strange nose, and an almost ornate kind of a crown, almost like a stony crown on its head, the top of its head. That thing is, I presume, alive rather than flash fossilized, since this is in the middle of having a meal, and it's fully exposed. It's not buried. Okay? That one photo proves complex biological life on Mars and probably dangerous life on Mars. And hybrid, by the way. Let me point that out too. There's no creature like that on Earth. But there are creatures that have those features. You know, wings, folded insect legs, amphibian mouths, humanoid faces, right? Eyes like ours. That is a hybrid. That's an example of what the Nephilim produced. Okay, that's just another version of it. I put it through HDR software to make it a little more evident in terms of the details, but I have better automatic versions where I haven't had to do any manual editing at all. I hate manual editing. To me, if somebody manually edits a photo and says, hey, this is on Mars, they could be lying, for all you know, right? I'd rather take the photo, enlarge it with the best enlargement software possible, then do automatic adjustments as much as possible in brightness and contrast, just to highlight what's there in the shadows. All right, more creatures on Mars. I don't know if I showed this one when I was here. I don't think I did last time. This head right here is very ornate, but it's got mandibles coming off the nose, right here. I think it's dead, probably a fossil. But it has a very ornate base to its neck, a kind of round-like ear here. The eyes are closed. It's got eyelids, and the eyes are closed. And these mandibles coming off of it right here. There's another creature's head right next to it. That's the nose, the eye area. Okay, another creature. Another one right here. I don't know what kind of creature that is, but it's a fossil, a head. Another head looking up toward the sky here, a creature that died as it was looking up. Right here is a little rodent with almost an elephant-like snout coming off the end of its mouth. And it's really hard to make out here, but it's covering up part of the mandible of this head right here. I know that's a rodent because I've got like half a dozen photos of them in other places on Mars, and they all look the same, with that snout-like nose. Okay? All right, there's an enlargement of that head. You can see that right there, with the mandibles coming off. That's some sort of insect animal hybrid. I don't know what it is, but anyway. Okay, a reptile eating a reptile. Another one. So you have, a creature chomping down on the head of another creature right there. Kind of hard to make out, but that's the top one and part of its neck and shoulder. Same kind of coloration that you see among some reptiles and birds and so forth on Earth. Could be a fossil where the colors are preserved. It's possible that these two are dead, but I'm not sure about that. But definitely not just rocks. Okay. All right, this is an unedited photo, like what NASA took. Right here is a little dinosaur that's alive, peering out from behind some rocks. NASA took all a series of photos of this, so NASA captured one photo with the whole thing right here. Above, at the top of the rocks, are fossils that are protruding through the rock. This little thing has a bright red eye, so you'll be able to see that in better photos if I'm able to show those this weekend. The head looks just like a Chinese dragon. If you were to look at China and its parades of dragons, each year, and look at the head that they make for that fake dragon, it looks exactly like this, which is strange. But it's peering across this short valley at this thing right here. That is another pterosaur type creature with its wings right here hanging down at its side. And its beak, it's got a beak right here, and its eye is right about there, and it's got this point on the back of its head, and it's sitting upright, and it's looking right at this thing, and this thing is looking right at it. Okay, right across the valley. Okay, same ones. Put through some HDR software to let you see a little bit more of what's in the shadows. You can see the eye is red here on this reptile. It's actually blood red. And it's looking at this thing, which you can see a little better right here. Two creatures on Mars, both alive. All right, this is another NASA photo. This is one where you can see the fossils at the top of the rock I told you about. Any paleontologist on Earth, any paleontologist, would look at this right here and say, if that's all they could see right there, stick it out of the ground and say, oh wow, what a weird set of fossils. They know that's not rocks. And yet it's just sitting there exposed on Mars. Okay, another example, same thing. A little dino with a red eye peering out from behind this, and this is fossils. I told you there were creatures that weren't merged together on Mars' surface. There are creatures with exposed legs, eyes where you can see the sclera, the eye whites, and pupils, perfect eyes, just like you'd see a creature on Earth with their eyes. They're so good you can see the eyeballs. Other creatures, I showed one to Pastor Carter where you can see the pink tongue sticking out of its mouth. So there are fossils with exposed teeth, rows of teeth like ours, sharp teeth like a shark, horns sitting on the surface of Mars like you'd find a horn sitting on the Earth that came off some creature's head. Eyeballs, noses, and then you get legs, like this one right here. A bent leg, that's a dog-like creature right there, but a very angular head, a bent leg right there, its shadow, it's above the ground. And this is another creature, some serpent creature popped up above the soil looking at this thing. I don't know if it's thinking about having a meal, but that's scurrying about on Mars. The rover captured that. This is a really weird one. Another humanoid face and a tortoise-like body with fat, stubby reptilian legs and super rough skin like you'd see on some reptiles on Earth. This is its body. There's a leg. There's a back leg. You can't really see the front leg there or the other leg. That's part of the creature. That's its head right there. And that's very enlarged. This is taken from quite a distance. This is another little creature that it's looking at, and it's actually looking at a variety of other creatures that are further in front of it. But I thought this was so interesting because of the face. And yes, it's blurry, but it looks humanoid. You can see the eye area, the nose area, the jaw area, and the mouth perhaps, and then perhaps what might be the ear area, the neck. And this very strange, rough, almost reptilian short body underneath it. Yeah. Okay. So the fellow who described the weird plesiosaur on Mars to me, which he'd been talking about publicly for years before NASA took the photos and before I knew, about this stuff on Mars. Also, when I interviewed him for 10 hours before he knew that I was writing anything on this, before he knew I had any photos, before he knew I could corroborate any of his claims whatsoever, before he knew I was an author. Okay? He agreed to interview with me for 10 hours, pardon me. We did multiple interviews, took about 10 hours to record it. And over the course of those interviews, you know, there were a lot of things he shared that I can't verify. But some things that he shared that I could verify. And this was one of the creatures that he described to me in detail in the interview. He didn't know I had this photo, and to this day he hasn't seen it because he suffered some vision issues, you know, before I was able to show him this photo. He's never seen this photo. And nobody's ever talked about it publicly, as far as I know, other than telling people about its existence. Nobody knows about it. And I'm going to talk about this in terms of this professor, an entomologist who was talking this month about Mars and life on Mars. You'll notice this thing is a fossil, probably. But, excuse me, let me go back. It's got 3 segments to its body, but it's got a V-like shape for wings, but there are no wings right here on the top of its back. So this is the first body segment, right here, like you'd see, for example, on a locust. 3 legs that go forward in segments, 3 segmented legs. So the back leg, the middle leg, you know, with a geometric pattern that you cannot get in geology on Earth. In other words, no combination of weathering or geology could produce this. Another leg right here that's segmented again, 3 segments. And then right here is part of the other front leg, partially buried, you can't really totally see it. Right here between, and this is its head, by the way, right here between the 2 front legs and it's underneath its head is a humanoid skull. It's a skull that would match a human being, as far as we can tell. Like it just had a meal. Okay? And the head, notice that the head is kind of heart-shaped. So I put this through an HDR filter to make it more visible. Here's another version. Same creature put through a different HDR filter, okay? Same thing, just to try to help you see some of the details a little better. I'll show some of these and better ones in the books. But anyway, the way that he described this creature to me was as a quote-unquote dump truck-sized locust. He said it was a huge dump truck-sized creature that could move very rapidly on the surface of Mars, an insect that had a mantid or heart-shaped head, and that was carnivorous. And if one was chasing you down, you might as well just sit on the ground and let it come eat you. You had no chance of escaping it whatsoever. Okay? And he called this thing a dump truck-sized locust. He's never seen this photo. He told me about this in the interviews, and he shouldn't have known about its existence. NASA doesn't know this exists in their photos. Okay? That kind of corroboration suggests to me either this guy was on Mars, because he told me about pterodactyls, about his so-called plesiosaur, you know, with a fat tortoise-like body, snake-like neck, and horse-like head. And then he told me about this thing. Shouldn't have known about any of that. And yet he could describe them in detail. The other fellow, who I think was also on Mars, or heard from someone who was on Mars who told them about these things, but I think he was there, was a Vietnam War veteran who was security on Mars for visiting quote-unquote VIPs in the 1970s and 80s as part of a secret space program. He never got there by teleportation. He said that he got there through reverse engineered anti-gravity craft, and usually TR-3B type craft. And you can look that up on the internet. TR-3B. It's rather than disc-shaped, it's triangular shaped. And it's not fully anti-gravity. It's partially propelled conventionally, but 90+% of its propulsion is anti-gravity. It was an early effort to produce our own anti-gravity craft. And that's how he was getting there in the 1970s, by teleportation. Anyway, he acted as a guard, supposedly, on the surface of Mars for this other fellow who described these creatures to me. And they were the ones, along with another person, who were shooting pterodactyls out of the air at one point. But he also described some unusual creatures on Mars' surface. I'll show those later this weekend. Different from these, that he shouldn't have known about, and he didn't know I had photos of it. In addition to that, both of these fellows described what they called a pulse pistol or a flash gun, which was one of the weapons they used on Mars' surface that was an energy weapon. It looked like a conventional pistol mostly, but it had a power pack that went into the back of it at the top of the grip, and the barrel was fatter, and it was a microwave type of a weapon. that you could use at about 50 to 100 feet. I think it was 50 to 100 feet rather than yards, but if you hit something close enough on Earth, it would literally turn them to dust, pulverize them. This was the claim that they both made. But if it was something like, say, a tyrannosaur on Mars, you just piss them off, unless they were really close. So, some creatures it was effective against and others not so much. But they both described this weapon to me. And guess what? I had photos of it, very good photos of it, that NASA took sitting on the surface of Mars abandoned, one of these weapons. So I showed it to this fellow who was the Vietnam War vet, along with Andrew Bjago's, that's the guy, the first guy, I can give his name, Andrew Bjago's plesiosaur type creature, and some others, and got his reactions. I captured him live after having interviewed this second fellow also for about 10 hours concerning Mars. So, I'm probably over my time, but we're talking about William Whitecrow, the second fellow. His real name was William Paris. He's now deceased. So I was able to record all my interviews with him, including that final half-hour interview, and captured his reactions live, both on video and audio. After that, he died, sadly, in I think February of last year. So I kept that video secret until I shared it. I began to share it last year, and it's now posted on my YouTube channel. So you can go to youtube.com/Timothy Cohen, and you can see some of these creatures and some others, and then also that final half-hour interview video with William Whitecrow, where I show him the pulse pistol, the flash gun on Mars, and so forth, and capture his reactions. But anyway, that's proof, by the way, that we've been to Mars, not just that there are creatures there. Whether these particular guys went to Mars or not, they had knowledge of things they shouldn't have known about, that NASA photographed years after they were talking publicly about them in some cases. In other cases, they described things to me that they didn't know NASA had photographed, even NASA doesn't know it's photographed in some cases. And they were able to tell me about them, and I knew about them because of these photos. All right, how are we doing for time, Pastor Carter? Shall I continue, or shall I pick this up later?
Let's pick it up later.
Okay. So we'll come back to impossible creatures later.
You got some
Okay.
more, two
Yeah.
services for you.
Thank you. That's it for tonight. I think we can ask for one more show of hands. Do you all still think there's no such thing as aliens? And when I say that, I mean non-terrestrial life, life not on Earth, after seeing some of this stuff. Some of you who didn't think there was life off Earth, do you now think there might be after seeing this stuff? Let me see a show of hands. Who's changed their mind, or at least open to changing their mind at this point? Huh? Okay, so you got a few. All right. I'm going to show you more stuff tomorrow. It's pretty cool. All right.